Pardon me?
Yep. All right. Here we are. Dr. Randall Gates, board-certified chiropractic neurologist, also a chiropractic physician at Gatesway to Health. And today we're talking about the MTHFR gene and addiction. And I'm here with Kathy. Good morning, Kathy.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. So we're talking about this subject because we've been going into genetics recently as it pertains to things like anxiety or PTSD and depression. And MTHFR was really kind of the cornerstone where a lot of doctors began to understand the relationship between genetics and how that may affect someone's biochemistry from a psychiatric perspective or an addiction perspective or a neurology perspective. And since that time, the MTHFR model has just blossomed, and now we have more awareness of these other genes that have been known for a long time, but we just have more awareness how these genes can really impact our thoughts and our mood and our ability to handle stress, our ability to not reach for a pack of cigarettes, which we'll go into today. So, Kathy, did you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I have a lot of first-hand experience with this, since everybody knows that I've talked about my MTHFR gene and how it, now that I know it exists, and in hindsight, look back at my relatives and family and how they've coped or not coped, and the coping mechanisms they've used, which cigarettes always seem to be a very large one in my family, which, lucky for me, it's another thing apparently I'm allergic to, because when I tried it, I got a headache. But
fortunate, yes.
Yeah, extremely, because some of my siblings are not as fortunate. But as we grew up, you know, we all knew it wasn't good for our parents, but both of them smoked. And I even think now, and I think, okay, what did I see in movies, on TV, and so forth? Every time someone takes a drag off of a cigarette, it's almost like that same thing that they do when you've got a Coca-Cola commercial and you get that, because when they took the drag on the cigarette, it was that kind of feeling that they would get from this. That feeling, now that I'm aware of what all goes on in the brain and what happens to people and how they're trying to deal with stress and anxiety and unhappiness or whatever, that's their coping mechanism. I mean, that allows them to, for lack of a better term, maybe decompress just for that little bit, just to let things down and kind of calm things. An alcoholic's not much different. Both are just, different ways of trying to self-medicate. The problem was with MTHFR, nobody really knew what they were medicating for. You just, apparently, I wrote down things like unhappiness, a coping mechanism, and the fact that they are definitely self-medicating because there's something wrong with them, and a lot of times they're not even aware, especially with MTHFR, that there's anything really wrong. And I've talked about this before with my anger and my rage. You know, I really thought that was normal. It's not. Who knew? But that's the way I always was from the time I was a small child. But because I came from a family who smoked, of course I tried it. And as we got older, and I'm a good deal older than you, so when it came out from Surgeon General says don't smoke and this is bad for you, then as caring children, we tell our parents, you shouldn't do this. I taught my son to hide the grandparents' cigarettes, whatever. And what's funny, he smokes today.
Of course.
As does my little sister. It's something that happens. But again, I think they found it as their own coping mechanism.
Completely.
Their own stress. If I have MTHFR, so do they. So whatever they needed to soothe themselves. And my father was a very intelligent man. But tell him, okay, this is bad for you. Then when they tell you have emphysema, then it's like, okay, and his caring family, brothers, sisters, everybody, hey, wake up, smell the coffee. This is really bad for you. No, he just keeps going until you're older and you've got COPD and, you're trying to get air any way you can, just because you've done this to your body. But what we know now that we didn't know then with MTHFR is that there are chemicals, supplements, whatever we can use that will
Right.
calm this sort of thing down. And I saw people use alcohol the same way. And I guess I'm old enough. In my family, our older members, my siblings, whatever, we didn't really get into, self-medicating with recreational drugs or whatever. But the younger generations in my family, I've seen that. And again, unhappy, self-medicating, trying to find some sort of calm, I think
Right.
is probably the biggest word I'm looking for. So
Yeah.
that's my take on it.
I think it's a great take. And I think up until now, life is what life is. And so life is hard in a lot of circumstances. It can be hard for the duration of a lifetime, or it could be hard for years or decades. And, so people just basically have to be tough, and they go through their day-to-day routines. They work, they may be tired, they have kids, they may not be getting adequate sleep, but doesn't really matter. You got to keep going. And so that's kind of the motto that so many of us fall into. And like you're saying, Kathy, then we need a release. We need something that's pleasurable. And so often that ends up being something like cigarettes or alcohol or some other substance. And from that standpoint, to relieve stress, it does make sense. And then also, like what you're saying with your dad, here he has emphysema, but he's still wanting to smoke, and that makes the person scratch their head like, what is wrong with you? Well, there's not necessarily something wrong with them, but things have changed in their brain to where they're so dependent on that stimulus, or their ability really to say, no, that's not good for me, has changed. It's changed neurobiologically. And so that's kind of what we'll go into today. But I think that's I think it's a great prelude. And I love your openness about your own struggles, because it's what a lot of people deal with. And these problems are everywhere. They're everywhere. Just not a lot of people are talking about them. But the more we talk about them, the better our global health in this country is going to be. Because when we look at the statistics, like I talk about frequently, 1/3 of people have anxiety. 1 out of 2 people have insomnia. Their brains just won't shut off. They have these stress mechanisms going. So that's my little diatribe. Anything you want to say off of that?
Yeah, because you know me, I love to connect the dots, and I can go way, way back.
Uh-huh.
But when we talk about the stress factor, and I grew up in a home with alcohol and tobacco,
Mm-hmm.
and I can remember going as a teen, and as a young teen, we're all always very anxious of social situations. And they had opened a teen center, and I'm like, okay. And, one of my friends said they're going to go. Well, they don't show up. So I'm there with a bunch of people that really not my bunch of kids that I hang out with.
Mm-hmm.
And very stressful. I find myself going into the refreshment area or whatever and grabbing a Dr. Pepper. And I know what Dr. Pepper tastes like. To me, I think it must have been more like what my dad would have had in the house as a shot of whiskey, because I thought, I need something that's gonna kick me,
Uh-huh.
And I start drinking. I drink like 3 or 4 Dr. Peppers, and I'm like, okay, this. And so I'm sitting here this morning thinking, this is me trying to cope and put myself in a better place with
Right.
this silly Dr. Pepper. And excuse me. And for those people who watch Big Bang Theory, Sheldon does this, and it is hysterical. He will go in when Penny's bartending and get virgin drinks and sit there and kick back 7 or 8 and say, "Okay, slow me down," because this is getting way out of control. But Sheldon's father drank.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I mean, this is something that we've seen society-wise that. And again, as I said, a learned behavior. This is something we see that if something's bugging us, throw back a shot, throw back a drink, grab a cigarette or something worse.
Mm-hmm.
Just, again, to cope. And I don't think Dr. Pepper really works, but as a 13-year-old, I thought anything to calm down. How what's the word? Uncomfortable I felt.
Interesting. Huh. So to answer kind of the looming question, the data on MTHFR. First, what is MTHFR? It's methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. Simply, it takes inactive folic acid from your diet and makes it active. Why is that important? It's important for detoxification in the body. There's one copy of the MTHFR enzyme that's more important for that. It's the 1298C. Then there's another copy that's more important for making chemicals like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine in the brain, quote unquote positive chemicals. And that's the C677 gene. Now, what researchers have found is that if you have an abnormality of the MTHFR enzyme, you are more likely to smoke. So that has been definitively shown in studies. So it kind of just confirms everything we're talking about here. It was initially kind of the consensus was that MTHFR did predispose people to alcoholism as well. That since has kind of come under fire, but that's common with any scientific debate. Some research is going to show there's evidence. Other research is going to say, well, we're not really sure. And they're going to question the studies and the integrity of the studies and all that stuff. But it does seem to relate to dependence for sure with smoking and quite possibly with alcohol. So there's that. And then the question would be, well, how does, okay, so if you have an MTHFR issue and you're maybe not making dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine as well, how does that relate to addiction? Well, kind of as Kathy keeps going through the soothing, the coping elements of these chemicals, what is that doing in our brain? A lot of people have some kind of familiarity with dopamine and addiction. Really what happens is that, get the brain model here. Here's our brain. And right through this region, it's called the ventral tegmental area, is where we produce dopamine. If I can get my brain level here. Okay, so we produce dopamine through here. Behind this region is where dopamine is produced for movement. So you've all seen a Parkinson's patient. That comes from an area called the substantia nigra, which is also in a similar region. And if you don't have dopamine, you have trouble moving. Well, if you have abnormalities of dopamine in this area, you may have abnormalities of mood or wanting to continually smoke or something like that. Now, researchers have found that when somebody reaches for the substance, let's just say it's a cigarette or a drink, you're going to get what's referred to as a phasic release of dopamine. So there's also tonic releases of dopamine. Dopamine is always being released from this area to generate to the prefrontal cortex, down through here, deeper regions of the brain, as I'm going into the center of the brain. Gosh, this is like flying a plane backwards with the brain model. So anyways, that's where the dopamine goes to, and it kind of nourishes neuronal circuits in these regions. So when you get a phasic release of dopamine, it's kind of that hit that Kathy's talking about, and it can be highly pleasurable. And that's why people keep going back to it, because they're stressed, like we're talking about. They've worked all day. They've worked 2 jobs. They haven't slept well. Whatever the reason is, the biopsychological reason, then we get a chemical dependence because we get that phasic dopamine release. The problem is that through time, the dopamine tends to go down. That's what researchers are seeing. So even though you're getting phasic releases of dopamine, your overall tonic release of dopamine goes down through the years, possibly because of the toxic effects of the substance like alcohol, or changes in the way that something like alcohol can affect dopamine receptors. And so then this is the current thought process as to why somebody has to keep going back to that substance, because their tonic release of dopamine is going down, so they need more phasic releases of dopamine. Does that make sense, Kathy?
It does, and I mean, we all know that they say alcohol is a depressant. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's kind of a vicious circle with alcohol, because you start drinking because you want to feel better, but it's going to depress you eventually anyway, no matter how many you throw back. So, it's a bad situation, but it is one that I see people, I think, one of their first things to go to, or at least it was in my generation and those previously. Now I think we see it more with recreational drugs. But it was definitely a thing that was supposed, the self-medicating with that was extremely, and still is, very, very strong.
It is. It really is. And then researchers are finding that alcohol selectively affects the prefrontal cortex from a toxic perspective. So you've heard Kathy and I talk extensively about the memory area deep in the brain and how that tries to shut off the fear center. Highly important as it relates to anxiety, depression, PTSD, insomnia. Well, they went in, they actually studied the quote unquote cytotoxic effects of alcohol in the memory area versus the prefrontal cortex. And they found that alcohol selectively damaged neurons in the prefrontal cortex, which is rather interesting too. Why is that important? Because this is your judgment, this is your decision-making area. So now we look at it, your tonic dopamine's going down, so you're having to hit the button to get the phasic dopamine to go up. And then your prefrontal cortex isn't working as well because of the toxic effects. So now your impulse control isn't there. And this is why people scratch their head. And of course, addiction is a very complicated model. We're not trying to just simply say it's only biological, but we're talking about the biological piece here. And this may give you better understanding if you know somebody who struggles with addiction, biologically what's going on with them. And then there are other findings, Kathy, pertaining to MTHFR and dopamine itself. There's just a litany of studies on this. The MTHFR does affect selectively dopamine, which is no surprise. I've kind of hit on that, but that's been substantiated. I think that pretty well summarizes it. Any thoughts on what I went through?
The one thought that keeps coming up is that I guess we should let people know that MTHR is pretty prevalent. I mean, it's not just a very select thing. It's 40 or 50% of the population out there is what the studies that I've seen. And in doing so, maybe gives us a good idea why you still see young people picking up cigarettes. Everybody knows it's not supposed to be good for you. People are vaping. They're doing all these different things just because they don't want to quit doing that. And as I said, one of my sons smokes. He's very upset when he's someplace and you're going and you can't have a cigarette. You have to go outside. You have to do this. He's like, why are they so against all of this? And I'm like, because it's really not good for you. and to them, I mean, it's almost like another attack that they don't need because they really do depend on this.
Yeah, and I know when I went to college and I saw so many kids smoking, and I was like, what are they doing? We know this is bad. At that time, it was around the year 2000. Like, we know the studies on this. Why are people still doing it? They're doing exactly for all the reasons you're saying and what we're saying.
Yeah, it's always been a big deal to me to think, especially, I gave my dad such grief. I'm like, you're an intelligent human being. What is the deal here?
Right.
And now as I'm older and I look back and I see the different things in his life and struggles that he had, I'm like, he needed this.
Right.
We didn't know about MTHFR. We didn't know we could give him folic acid and the different things that would have calmed that down and would have alleviated the need for that. I mean, and I know I coped in my early 20s, and I think everybody goes through this. Man, woman, whatever, is when you're growing up and trying to deal with things is, oh God, people expect things of me. What am I going to do? I'm supposed to come up with something I want to do for the rest of my life. I'm supposed to marry somebody. I'm supposed to have children. So many kids feel those pressures that's when, I think that's one of the reasons why college drinking it's become almost a joke, but high school and college drinking, that's part of the reason for that kind of stuff. It's just those pressures. Those kids need to blow off that steam because if not, they're going to do something else.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a great point. Yeah. They're supposed to have their lives figured out, and most of them don't. And yeah, that can be stressful. Very interesting.
So that's my take on it.
Okay, I think it's a great
definitely take. People need to be aware that MTHFR is out there, and if they're suffering with something like this, it might be something that they want to look into and see if they can't curb it another way.
Yeah, I think that's a great take-home point. So, of course, depending on what the addiction is, I mean, they can be horrifically sad, and lots of times family members feel helpless. Everybody's trying to help, but they don't know what to do. And if it's something like smoking, probably not as big of a deal. If it's something like heroin, we'd probably most of us would consider it's a bigger deal. But anyways, I mean, the biological process is still all pretty similar. So if you do know someone with addiction, I would recommend at least considering looking into this MTHFR issue, because it is important. And if you guys want us to talk about more genetics next week, we can. This seems to be something you're all kind of interested in. We can talk about COMT and addiction. But yeah, I think this was a pretty good summary particularly for alcohol and smoking as it pertains to MTHFR. Alrighty, Kathy, anything else?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
All right, so if any of you have any questions, post them on Facebook. I'll try to come back and answer them. And you can watch this on YouTube. We recorded it live there as well. And we'll see you next week with an interesting topic. Give us your feedback. Thank you, everybody. Okay.